Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the summit stage, what I like to think of as the most bespoke and elite stage at the CogX conference this year. We've handed out over 42,000 tickets. We had 60,000 people online on Monday, and this particular area is populated by top-level FTSE 100 and tech companies. And I'm delighted to bring you the first talk of the day. It's on a subject that just grows in interest and complexity. It is on investigative intelligence, which is quite a mouthful when you've only had one cup of coffee. Two worlds of human rights and AI. How do we make these two work in hand? How can we use them to protect our human rights, and how can they enhance them? To lead this discussion, I'm going to introduce to you Jennifer Robinson, who's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers. Good morning, Jennifer.
Good morning. Good morning. The question that we're being asked is one that's often missed, I think, in the human rights community, is how we as human rights activists and advocates can benefit from and use artificial intelligence. So how can we protect human rights using artificial intelligence and these technologies? And I'm delighted to be joined today by a very diverse and interesting panel. We have John Randles, CEO of Siren, an Irish data company offering investigative intelligence platform. We have Mandy, a philanthropist and human rights activist working primarily to support victims and survivors of honour-based violence and cultural abuse. And also Paul Van Zyl, who co-founded the International Centre for Transitional Justice and served as the Executive Secretary of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So please join me in welcoming our panellists. And I thought perhaps to kick us off, it might be better to start with a definitional question, John, about what are we talking about when we're talking about investigative intelligence?
Yeah, so in terms of investigative intelligence, I think you have to just stand back and look at where people live their lives now, particularly as digital transformation has received a huge boost with COVID-19, everybody's living their lives online. And with that, you see law enforcement, intelligence, fraud analytics is really something that is trying to catch up with that. So I heard recently from a partner of ours that in most investigations now, 90% of evidence is digital, right? So what people are struggling with then is, with the advent of AI, how does AI fit into that? So when your investigations around, say, financial crime, cyber threat, or a general crime are so digital in nature, people are looking to AI to help in that. And I think we're entering a world now where investigations have moved line. Investigative intelligence is really just the methods by which people use available data, private data, public data that people need legal recourse to get access to, but building the full picture of what has happened, or building evidence for either prosecution or further investigation. So it's a very broad area. People have been doing investigations with digital technologies for years, but as more and more of our lives have gone digital, it's just a much bigger topic across much more diverse areas of the landscape now than it has ever been before.
Great. And I mean, one of the things that I find very interesting as someone who's interested in accountability for mass crimes, for example, is the way in which data is increasingly being used, whether it's citizen journalism, video technology captured from people on the ground, how that's being drawn up together to be able to paint a picture of a broader systemic conflict or widespread human rights violations. And so, Paul, I thought, given your background working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa and looking at mass human rights violations worldwide with the International Centre for Transitional Justice, could you just explain to us a little bit about the context of the sorts of human rights abuses that you're used to encountering through your work, and how you see the potential opportunities in this kind of use of big data for human rights accountability?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you think about what's happened from the days when we, ran the Truth Commission in South Africa, a wildly successful endeavor, but very analog in some senses. We took 24,000 statements from victims and used that to analyze patterns and trends, command responsibility, chains of command, political responsibility, and did so in a rather, old-fashioned analog way. And if you want to sort of, for a moment, delve into both the perils and the possibilities of AI at this moment, you just need to think about, for example, analyzing torture. So if there's a widespread and systematic torture in a country, one of the ways it's widespread and systematic is you gather information from torture survivors, and they tell you it happened at all places of detention spread across the country in at disparate times. You begin to discover at whose hands particular units of particular security forces. You begin to discover that it occurs in relation to particular categories of detainees. And from that, you can begin to discern that this is a pattern. And if it's a pattern, what are the chances that it happened randomly, or what are the chances are that it was directed, ordered, authorized? And then you can also correlate that with patterns of accountability. If there is systematically no justice, no truth-telling, no accountability, and no investigation for these crimes, you can begin to say, well, this had to have been supported and authorized, and those in positions of power failed to act or directly ordered. And you can then extrapolate that out across all categories of human rights violations. And as you know well, Jen, international crimes, when you prosecute them, certain categories require evidence of widespread and systematic patterns of abuse. They require evidence of intent to eliminate in whole or in part particular groups when you're talking about genocide. And all of this is your capacity to prove and establish this, both from a truth-seeking point of view and in courts of law, are greatly enhanced by being able to aggregate data. And therefore, there's a huge opportunity here to deploy AI to quickly discern patterns, to detect signals from the noise. And this has to be, an arrow in the quiver of human rights defenders and people using both truth-seeking and accountability techniques to try and promote justice. Of course, the opposite also applies. We now know that AI is being used increasingly by authoritarian regimes who have a particular penchant for using AI combined with surveillance, combined with the ubiquity of devices such as mobile phones, to detect their own patterns. And their own patterns are interested in seeing where human rights activists are present, where resistance and activism to their repressive rule is present, and to quickly discern their own inverse patterns of responsibility. Who's organizing it? Who's in charge of the resistance? Who is seeking to mobilize ordinary citizens against authoritarian rule? And track down the opposite of command responsibility, the people who are seeking to campaign for human rights and democracy. So this is a very delicate moment where both of these things are in balance. And I've always, believed that technology is, in some senses, amoral. It's up for grabs, and it's our responsibility to harness it for good.
That's right. And before we get into sort of the potential downsides and perhaps how John, as a proponent of this technology, might answer some of our questions about the downsides, I think it might be useful to elicit perhaps some more examples of the ways in which AI might be used in a helpful way towards human rights activities. So, some of the examples that I came across in thinking about this before the session was the ways in which it's been used to gather evidence of war crimes in Syria, collecting over 1.5 million videos from what's been happening on the ground in the Syrian archives, or likewise to identify mass graves in Mexico, predicting which counties are most likely to have hidden graves of the disappeared based on databases of media reports, other forms of data, etc. And so I was wondering, Paul, and perhaps we could bring in Paul, and Mandy, you could speak to a little bit more about some of the specific ways in which you've seen AI used for good in the context of the human rights issue.
So one of the good things is around apps like Traffic Jam, where we've been able to identify, and by facial recognition, by say if a sex worker was put on an advert, that actually we can find missing people. So there's been technology being used for good. But the one point that I would like to make around big data and people with real-time sharing their everyday movement, when people are living in war zones or they're living in refugee camps, they don't have data. We aren't able to always pick up their trends and things. And I have real concerns that those people who are most affected sometimes have been really left behind, and actually who owns that data. So it's about looking at that. And there has been some real good things where cell citing, and it's helped with evidences in court. But one of the things that we have seen across the world is that courts and judges and barristers sometimes are too dependent on AI in the courtroom, and sometimes it has a place, but it's also about people being innocent until proven guilty.
I wonder if you can explain for us specifically about the way AI has been used in the context of trafficking and identifying victims of trafficking.
Okay, so there's been a lot of apps now where by facial recognition, and the police across the world have worked together with Interpol and other places like that. So there's an app that's called Traffic Jam, which I think the police and everyone else uses. And what that does is, say if I'm a missing person and my family don't know where I've gone, and all of a sudden I turn up on an ad on Facebook or something like that, or I turn up on some sort of other social media platform, by facial recognition sometimes. So what it might have been trying to find somebody might take a long time. Now we may be able to find people within days and weeks. So, you know, trying to find and support victims. And also it's all, you know, there's a lot of money being made by criminals around trafficking in humans and everybody else. And we need to look at how do we address that. And I think Paul might probably have more experience than I do around the data side of this and how we can share intelligence in real time. So one of the other things I've done is I've done a lot of safeguarding of young people around the world. And sometimes we've had to work with different police forces and share intelligence. And then we're able to really pull things together. And if that is around human trafficking, we're able to work with banks. We're able to look at patterns of money laundering and all those other things as well. So it does all go hand in hand. And it becomes evidence in court as well then, so if we do that.
I think as part of this discussion has touched on a few issues that I have big concerns about as a human rights lawyer. I mean, particularly the way in which AI is, in the context of mass government surveillance and mass collection of the data of individuals, the way in which AI can be applied to that data to predict and create quite a detailed picture of individuals within the context of, and how we deal with, for example, how that data might be used to prevent crime or to protect people against human rights abuse, but at the same time intrudes upon our privacy. We've also mentioned, I mean, we've mentioned facial recognition technology, and of course IBM put out a statement this week saying that they're no longer going to be making it general purpose facial recognition analysis software available because of concerns about the way that it's being used for mass surveillance, for racial profiling, that Paul touched upon. So how do we start to grapple with these questions around this sort of the potential collective benefit of big data and the intrusion upon individual rights? And how do you address that in the context of your business, John, and the way that your technology operates?
Yeah, one of the things that I've seen, particularly over the last 5 years, is where there's so much new respect for data that I think you can put an awful lot of that down to GDPR, right? And I'm talking about that having spread much further than the jurisdiction of the EU, right? So for example, all around the world, people are looking to see, you know, when I use data, am I using it in a way that is in line with the policy of GDPR, or am I opening myself up into issues that that will present themselves down the line? So for example, even though it's not legislation in countries like the US, people are very, very conscious of having GDPR-like responsibilities. And I think as well, one of the things, the impact that has had is people are, much more looking for a justification around the use of data. So say, for example, a lot of the perception is the computers are taking over, AI is making decisions, and the way we see AI being used is much more in an augmenting of users of data rather than replacing. So an awful lot of people really get turned off by the idea that I run an algorithm, it makes a decision, we're following the lead of the computer. What we're seeing much more is a term Gartner used to describe the use of data, which is really augmented analytics. So you have an analyst that's trying to solve a problem. So for example, it's a financial crime, it's a network of insurance fraud, or it could be tax evasion, or things like identity theft. So in that context, people tend to use AI to spot, are these the same actors that are trying to disguise themselves, doing things like entity resolution? Am I seeing anomalies? Is there statistical outliers? Is there clusters? But it still comes back to an analyst having to make a decision. And if the AI, suggests something, can you justify that in court? Do you have an easy to understand way of saying, I came to this decision and the investigation led me here because of this logic? And sometimes AI isn't transparent enough, is too much of a black box, and it doesn't survive that challenge because it tends to be pure mysterious. And it's something we don't work in the visual facial recognition as well, because it's such a minefield. It's much more straightforward dealing with more standardized data sets that are more transactional than ones that are based on opinion, and that's where we're at very, very early stages in a lot of this AI technology. And it's really about augmenting people that are trying to do good, trying to protect people, trying to protect financial assets, trying to protect networks. And I think.
Can I ask you a question? Sorry. Yeah. So at the moment, we all kind of almost sleepwalk and give our data away without even thinking about it and recognizing what we're doing. I mean, I'm guilty of it because I'm at home now and I'm making sure I do my 10,000 steps at least. And, but who owns that data? And if that data had a value to it, do you think things would change then around privacy and around organizations? Because one of the things that young people always say to me when we're doing hacks and when I'm working with people in around the world, in Africa and Asia and other places, they're saying, well, the 30 human rights laws that we have for everyone, the right to privacy and all of those things apply, but actually there should be a first one for data around that I should have ownership of my data, my information. But the thing is, some people don't actually know what they're putting out there. So I just wanted to put
it's a really interesting question, and I bet in the small print when you sign up for your tracker to say it's 10,000 steps per day, and I'm sure the legal people will have a lot of views on this, is people really don't know what they're giving up. They sign up for a service, you sign up for something that sounds cheap, it sounds free, but as they used to say, if you're not paying for something, you are the product. You're generating the data that somebody else is making money from, or if you're not paying full value for something, then your data is going somewhere else to effectively somebody's making money from it. So there's always, to me, this fine balance. People will give away their data for free where somebody's making money from them, but they're more concerned, and often rightly so, about how their data is used in the protection space. where it's almost like we need to rebalance that and get people to be more concerned about the data they're just streaming off that people are making money from. And that's more about.
There are countries around the world that don't have the same freedom as us. They don't have the same rights to privacy, and they don't live in a democracy. They are very oppressed. Especially colleagues of mine are human rights campaigners and activists, and sometimes they have small data. And when they've tried to work with companies, Jen, and they've not sort of taken that small data on board. So, for instance, I think I read something about Nokia, that a woman had gone in Asia and started saying to them, look, a lot of people are using mobile phones. This is a few years ago, and they were like, oh, we're not interested in that because it wasn't big data. Even though this woman had small evidence-based data, the big companies monopolized that whole sector, and actually those young people were left behind and nobody was listening to their voices. So it's just about actually, how do we make it a level playing field? I mean, that's a question to everyone, really, I'm thinking.
Well, Paul, I was wondering whether you might be able to give us some insight into the way that ICTJ has considered or not the use of technology and weighing these pitfalls around the potential benefits.
I mean, the broad aggregation of data in order to determine accountability is absolutely essential. And it's clear that what AI is doing is enabling a far more both rapid and sophisticated way of determining accountability. So, there are examples where in conflict zones, you can aggregate cell phone data from ordinary citizens in order to discern flight paths of jets. And if you're able to determine flight paths of jets, you're able to pretty much, and if there's only one actor in a conflict which has jets and a chemical munition is dropped, and Syria is a real example of this, then you're able to aggregate and determine from people who have their phones on that a jet went overhead. You're able to map it against space and time. You're able to know that it had to have taken off based on this flight path, based on these audio trails from people's cell phones, that it had to be in a jet. It took off from this base, and then a bomb was dropped at this moment. And then you're able to say that this had to have been a government actor in a context where the government has denied it. Similarly, people like the forensic architecture are able to aggregate multiple data points together in order to look at telemetry, at projectiles, at the way that houses were destroyed by munitions, or the way that snipers or combatants, the direction that they had to have fired from. And if they had to have fired from this direction, and we know that one side was on this side and another was on that side, this isn't the fog of war. You're able to discern who is responsible. So I think there is no doubt that deployed in the right hands, AI can be a wildly sophisticated device in establishing the kind of, predicates of justice, which is establishing the facts in a way that are irrefutable and can be proved beyond reasonable doubt, and then doing so in courts of law in ways that get you justice.
I totally agree. And for anyone who hasn't looked at forensic architecture's work, the work that they're doing in recreating human rights violation scenes and for the purposes of courtroom advocacy is really quite remarkable. So I definitely, for anyone who's in this session, definitely go and have a look at their website. I think before we open up to questions, there's one issue around AI that I really wanted us to touch on, and I wanted to sort of read a quote from a colleague of mine, Nanny Jensen-Reventlow, who is a brilliant digital rights lawyer who runs a digital rights fund and has been doing a lot of work around the sort of the inherent biases. So She says society's existing power structures are reproduced through the technology we create. A common and incorrect assumption is that technology is neutral. The apps, algorithms, and services we design ingrain choices made by its creators. When those designers are predominantly male, privileged, and white, this may pose serious problems for the rest of us. And she uses a number of really important examples about the way in which our inherent human value and biases are seen in the way that AI and various technologies use in the context of a human rights space. So whether we're talking about predictive policing and the racial profiling and biases that come out as a result of using big data in a policing context, facial recognition technology. Also things like the use of data in recruitment. So they showed in one particular example that it was replicating human biases around privileging white male applicants. How do we get at this problem, John, around, and just to open it up to all three of you about the dangers of bias within what are perceived to be value neutral technology?
Yeah, I think the point has to be made that oftentimes AI is not very intelligent. You know, we try to subscribe great value to this. Artificial intelligence is the future, right? But at the end of the day, there's particular things AI is good for. There's particular things that it really is not doing a great job at yet. So that's why we're firm believers that it augments the analyst. You know, smart people still have to make decisions. So if you're trying to do future prediction about, you know, recruitment or crime, and you're not looking at the inherent biases of it, you're trusting the computer far too much. You know, you're trusting the data far too much, and you know, the AI has a long way to go to catch up that we can trust it as well as a trained analyst or somebody with experience. You know, you've got a lot of data that will lead you down a certain track. So that's why we really think that you need to be very targeted, very finite, very careful with your application in AI. And we often confuse aggregation of data or looking at relationships across data with AI, which is making decisions on the data. So you know, bringing data together is good normally because you get a better picture on the real world. You know, how many data sets you add to problem space will determine how likely you are to see what's really happening. You know, allowing the machine to make a decision on top of that can be difficult if the machine hasn't been doing it for 20 years. You know, we often overstate the amount of data we have ourselves to make decisions and to kind of really counter the biases we have in ourselves. And a lot of humans still aren't good at that. So how can we expect the machine to be good at that?
Touch upon as we all know, that women and people of BME communities are still fighting for inequalities, and I think that's come more to the surface than ever before during COVID. But one of the things that I've had a real concern about is I'm all for AI, and I think that it's the future and we've got to embrace it. But actually, it's about the bias and it's about the values that people are imposing into these machines. So if you have misogynist views, you have far right views, or you have other extreme views, as much as AI can be for good, it could be misused by people by putting out their own out-of-date values. Because actually, I think that we need to have people from all across the world with different ethnicities and backgrounds and all genders who can actually contribute.
Yeah, and Mandy, just to add to that, in terms of, you know, a dangerous side of AI that we're seeing emerging now is deep fakes. You know, people creating videos that are generated by AI that are not reality. They're just not reality at all. So what people are looking into now, how do you use AI to target deep fakes? How do you use AI to spot bad actors doing information operations with deepfakes? That's a really big concern, you know, looking down the line in terms of people spreading misinformation around the world. It's just a huge issue going to emerge much more over the next few years.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, John, because one of the issues that I find as a media lawyer representing clients in all kinds of defamation cases is the ways in which online technology and artificial intelligence can be used to attack women, for example, online, but also the way in which, so you have this astroturfing of women trying to affect their reputation if they've made an allegation against a man, for example. But then the flip side, of course, is the ability for artificial intelligence to track the abuse of female MPs online. So we have this sort of upside and downside constantly in the use of this technology. But I wanted to open this up to some audience questions, and we've got one so far about, which I'll put to all of you. What do you see how the pandemic has affected people's privacy and rights over the Track and Trace app? So of course there's been a lot of controversy. I'm from Australia, but also here in the UK, about this tracing app that would be used to trace the spread of COVID. So how do you all, what's your reaction to this sense of the balance between our right to privacy and what might be the collective benefit of a big data collection app for the purposes of protecting public health?
I mean, I can take a first crack. I'm sure there'll be a diversity of views, but I mean, I think there is no question from a public health point of view, any epidemiologist worth their salt will tell you that an essential part of preventing a second wave and containing the pandemic is going to be effective tracking, tracing, that this is absolutely essential. And that by definition entails an erosion of privacy. And in good constitutional systems, we do this balancing all the time. We erode privacy and then we weigh it against other public benefits, in this case, public health. And then, the key thing in these circumstances is to create regulatory frameworks which appropriately safeguard and put in place checks and balances in relation to people's privacy, so that it doesn't then be used as a way of tracking down human rights activists and arresting them. I think the flip side of this and the benefit of it is that if you're able to establish large amounts of data about populations at risk, you can also start doing the kind of advocacy work around the ways in which the pandemic is adversely affecting particularly vulnerable groups, and in this case, BME communities, and then begin to say there's something deeply wrong in our society, and there is, continuing structural inequality and, dare I say it, racism in countries in which, disproportionate numbers of people of color are dying as a result of this pandemic. So again, I think it comes down to technology is neutral and amoral. The regulatory frameworks that we impose upon it and the uses to which we put it are very much up for grabs, and that requires the human rights community and the activist community to be on the front foot, not on the back foot.
Yeah.
Agreed. Now, Mandy, we've had an audience question which is specifically directed at something that you'd mentioned, that you'd said that courts are sometimes too willing to rely on digital evidence. Is that other panelists' experience in the jurisdiction in which we work? And I have to say, I'd be interested to hear your perspective, Mandy, because you didn't really explain the example when you provided it. Because in my experience as an advocate and someone working in the court system, is that I see very little use of digital evidence in the context of domestic, at least in this jurisdiction. But I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about your example.
So I work a lot with young people all over the world, and so if we look at in America right now, and it was something like even Black Lives Matters have been putting out messages about the numbers of people who from the Black community who have been in prison, and actually in recent years some of the intelligence has been around cell sighting and other things around young people that they have used, and they used a lot of their mobile data, and a lot of their privacy was fringed. Sorry, I can't seem to hear myself.
We can hear you. Okay.
Did you hear that? Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I feel I sound like I'm in water myself. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear. I sort of froze for a moment. Sorry, I'm having a few tech problems. Sorry. So it was around some of the young people who are in like South America and in America and other countries like that, where they have felt that actually AI has been a disadvantage for them. But evidence is evidence. But what we were trying to say is around some of the cell sighting, where police can use intelligence to show that some people were somewhere else. But they are sort of saying that if we look at the number of people that are in prison and the different ethnicities that are in prison for certain crimes, that actually a lot of that evidence had come from AI use of technology. But I do welcome that it's not been used for violence against women. It's not been used properly for child protection cases. So I do feel like there is a place for it, but I think that we need to monitor it and respect everyone as well. Sorry.
Okay, we've had another question about the use of masks in the pandemic for facial recognition. I think it is a really interesting question. Of course, we've had the controversy this last week around the Black Lives Matter protests around the world, and whether they ought to go ahead in the context of the pandemic, and that a measure that was a public health measure was imposed, that people must wear their masks, which as a human rights lawyer is interesting, because historically it has been an offence to wear a mask to a protest because they can't use facial recognition technology. So there's an interesting sort of a paradox, I guess, in the way that we're using it. But did anyone want to comment on the recent protests and the way that we're having to wear masks and that how that impacts on facial recognition technology?
I mean, I don't think it's my view is you want to balance the rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of speech with the rights to, with appropriate public health regulation. And, my view, a sensible compromise is to say that you favor the rights of people to gather and assemble, and you impose restrictions because you want to make sure that, that the virus is not transmitted. And we now have very good data to suggest that the wearing of masks, multiple respected authorities, including the WHO, have now said, and now in the UK belatedly, that this is something that should be done. I mean, there is a long and tricky history of the use of masks in protests. I mean, down from the Ku Klux Klan onwards. And, in a lot of regulation we did in South Africa was a reluctance to allow people to wear masks in protests, mainly because the people who wore masks were people who were wanting to commit acts of violence and vandalism. And therefore, what you wanted to say is, if you're going to protest, be accountable and show up and reveal your identity. I think it becomes even more complicated in authoritarian settings, where the people of Hong Kong would incline to wear masks, because if you go out and protest on the streets and the Chinese authorities can know who you are, they can arrest you. So it's a very, very tricky balancing act in these circumstances.
Well, we have 5 minutes left, so I wanted to offer each of the panelists the opportunity to offer their reflections on the conversation and where you see the balance lying. Of course, as I said at the outset, for me, this is an interesting conversation because of the way the questions posed. As a human rights lawyer, where I'm normally thinking about the adverse impact of AI and how we protect individual rights vis-a-vis AI, in particular the right to privacy, but we've been talking a lot about where the benefits, how we might utilize this technology in a way that's positive for human rights. So I wonder if you want to offer just a couple of minutes of reflections on the conversation.
Yeah, let me jump in there. I think it's a great conversation just to start reflecting, where are we in the use of AI, and how real is that use of AI? And one thing that I think is really important going forward is that people are transparent in that use, so that if AI is brought into place in terms of whether it's financial crime detection, general law enforcement, that there is auditability, that there is justification, that it's not just a black box, and I think that will help generate more confidence that it's being used for good, rather than it's something that people can't understand. So once something is a complete black box, or not understandable or transparent, people can be rightly suspicious then. But for me, it keeps coming back to justification. Why did people make decisions? In what way? What was the machine use in bringing people to those conclusions, and then being as transparent as possible about it?
Brilliant. I would just say that by 2030, the UN has 17 goals that it wants to achieve, about looking at tackling poverty, educating other people, tackling inequality, and AI is the future, and it is working in real ways to help us to achieve that. And I think we can see that today where children are being taught at home. So I just think that this is a conversation that needs to continue, and it's been really interesting to learn from everybody. And so thank you for that.
Yeah, and I'd say that I think that the single most important way that AI can help is in the rapid detection and discernment of patterns. And patterns can help with, as I've said, detecting human rights violations. They can help with detecting discrimination. They can help detect disparities between groups of people, even where there isn't discrimination actively, but where disparate results occur. They can help rapidly look at patterns in the public health realm, in the climate realm. All of these things are incredible tools for people seeking a more just and equal world. What it requires, I think, is transparency, disclosure, openness about the basis upon which AI is used in decision-making, particularly where public authorities are involved. And then I think there's an entirely different playbook in authoritarian settings where AI can clearly be used to violate human rights abuse. And that will then have to be handed to activists and citizens to find innovative ways to resist it when you can't rely on courts or parliaments to create proper regulatory regimes.
Well, thanks very much, everyone. This is certainly, I think, for me as a human rights advocate and someone who cares deeply about human rights, that the possibilities and the future of how we can use this kind of technology is exciting. But of course, safeguards and transparency is important, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. So thanks to CogX for hosting us today.
And thank you to Jen, to John, to Paul, and to Mandy for a really thought-provoking discussion. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you all on platforms soon again. If you're staying with the Summit stage, please join us. We've got a new session starting in 15 minutes, which is Philanthropy. Hope to see you there. Thanks.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.